homeschooling for many families is really not a compartment of their life, but runs like a thread throughout their entire lifestyle. A lot of families, even if they're not doing active school with their children who are before school age, still sort of involve them in, as Charlotte Mason would say, education as atmosphere. And for me, that's something that families do. That is family life, is the rearing of children together as a family. And that is really an educational pursuit. And every parent is, in fact, an educator.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hello, my name is Jim Mason. I'm president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is another episode of Homeschool Talks, where I get to talk to interesting people about things that interest me, and I hope will interest you out in homeschool land as well. I'm very delighted today to welcome Dixie Dillion Lane to the program. She is a homeschool mom, and she is a longtime academic researcher in homeschooling. And she writes a lot of essays about homeschooling and other topics as well. So welcome, Dixie.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Well, let's hear about your experience. You went to Notre Dame University where you wrote your dissertation about homeschooling. And I believe you started writing that dissertation before you became a homeschool mom.
Yes, that's true. I met my husband in graduate school at Notre Dame, so I wasn't even married when I started my research, and then sort of had my children along the way, which was a very interesting experience because I sort of got to live through some of the considerations that parents have as I was talking to parents and researching about education too.
Now, how did you happen to decide to study homeschooling in Los Angeles? First of all, what's the title of your dissertation?
The dissertation is called Skipping School, which I think is a little bit clever, maybe. And I wrote about homeschooling because I come from a family of educators. And when I was growing up, things like asking questions, it was just the air we breathed. So we were always trying to find things out and figure things out. So I was used to thinking about education. I had read really widely in the field when I was in high school just because I was so interested. And then when I got to graduate school, I had done a lot of work in religious history. And I was interested in finding a dissertation topic that would put together religious history, history of the family, and history of education. And so homeschooling seemed like a good fit. And because that's such a broad topic, I knew I would want to do a study that would be narrow enough to let me really get into the primary sources, the voices of people who actually homeschool or opposed homeschooling. And Los Angeles seemed like a very good fit because, unlike many places, it had a large diversity of types of homeschoolers. Whereas for much of history, homeschoolers of certain types have sort of congregated in different areas. But in Los Angeles, I could talk to conservative Christian homeschoolers and I could talk to hippies. So that's what I wanted to do, was get a representative sample. I
just want to point out that some hippies are also Christians.
Absolutely.
And choose to homeschool. It's kind of a weird thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in Los Angeles, especially, there's a lot of mixtures. Mm-hmm. So your dissertation is called Skipping School. And just as a side note, while that's such an apt title, when my kids were growing up, when people would ask them in the grocery store, where do you go to school? They would say, oh, we don't go to school. We're homeschooled.
Right. Well, the title it's a little bit of a play because what does that really mean, skipping school? So it's a reference to the fact that early homeschoolers had tangles with truant officers who really considered them not to be receiving any sort of schooling. And then we also had some early homeschoolers who were trying to replicate school at home. And of course, now we have this development of all sorts of different types of education that go from everything from people having a schoolroom in their home with desks and a chalkboard to, the most committed unschoolers who are doing something very different altogether.
So unschoolers, just so you know, like to call themselves self-directed educators. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
They rebranded. As we all do eventually in America, they rebranded.
Well, I'm pretty sure John Holt would be okay with that.
I think so.
But at the time, it was important to emphasize, I think, that he was trying to move away from school, not just have something school-like at home.
So your dissertation covered a number of decades from the 50s into 2010. And as you followed through those decades, you had some interesting observations. Why don't you tell us about those?
Well, one of the things that I really became interested in was the relationship between homeschooling and institutions and homeschooling and the public. Because as a historian, I know that literacy has always been very high in the United States relative to other countries. And we began our public education system very early on. But part of that has always been an emphasis on local control in education. And now if you look at the 20th century, you would probably see a narrative of schools becoming more consolidated, seeing more state and federal control, whether it's through actual legislation or just pressure, and funding pressure. But I really came to see that belief in localism in education has not gone away. So what I was interested in looking at was, why did people homeschool and how did they do it? Did they do it against institutions, against government, against school? Were they anti-school? Or did they do it in conjunction with local resources that might be government or school resources? Or did they do it in a way that went sort of beyond all of that? And what I discovered was it began as something that really was very countercultural and ended up as something where homeschoolers were really willing to interact with many different kinds of institutions and people as long as they retained authority over their children's education. So I say that it went from an anti-institutional approach to what I called a post-institutional one.
Now you ended your research or your dissertation in the year 2010, which followed on to a very important case in California, in Los Angeles County. And you devoted a considerable amount of your dissertation to looking at the cases known as In Re, Rachel L. and Jonathan L. How did the study of those cases and all of the turmoil, well, first, maybe you could tell us what the cases involved, and then how did the turmoil and those few months that those cases were around affect your study?
So Rachel and Jonathan L. were siblings, and they were a Los Angeles family, and there was a history of various types of suspicions of neglect and abuse in the family. And so the verdict in question was a 2008 Los Angeles, I think a Court of Appeals verdict, and this wasn't on anyone's radar in terms of homeschooling organizations. It wasn't being reported by newspapers as having anything to do with homeschooling. But when the verdict came back, often, as I'm sure you know, Jim, in that kind of case, when there is a question of abuse, sometimes a court will require that a family send students to a school because then they'll be in contact with teachers and the teachers can sort of keep an eye on things. But that's not what they did in this verdict. Instead, the court actually declared that homeschooling, which the L family practiced, was unconstitutional in California. Nobody saw this coming, as you know, and there was a public outcry. Organizations like HSLDA organized very quickly a response, reviewed the cases, and of course had a very deep understanding of precedents. Including another case I talk about, Turner, from the 1950s. So it was very interesting. And the upshot of it was that there was an appeal and the court reversed its decision. Now, I was particularly fascinated by this case because I wish everyone knew about it, because it indicated that though the court said homeschooling was unconstitutional, few people in California thought so. including the legislature. So one of the arguments that was used was pointing out places in the Code of Education and other places in legislation that indicated that the legislature presumed homeschooling was legal. And so it's just wonderful to me that the court caught up on something that people already sort of believed. And it really indicated that even though homeschooling was still at that point only a couple of million students nationwide, that it really was something that was not considered just totally wacky anymore.
Yeah, in the course of that case, disparate people as different from each other as the governor, who at that time was Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, and the Attorney General, who at that time was Jerry Brown, otherwise known as Moonbeam, both came out in favor of homeschooling before the final court decision.
Yes, and I think there was even a brief filed by the LAUSD. You can correct me on that, but that's what I found. And that is the school district that these children would have attended. So, the fact that that school district itself didn't think it was inappropriate for children to be homeschooled was really telling beyond the legal ramifications.
There's a little bit more to that story. And I would say that the LA, so I was at the oral argument, and full disclosure, everyone, I worked on this case quite a lot from beginning to end. But the lawyer for this was really remarkable because for oral argument, the Court of Appeals allowed 2 hours. Yeah, 2 hours. And 5 lawyers for each side got to argue. And one of the lawyers that argued was for the LA Unified School District. And he had written a brief that kind of said, oh, well, this is horrible what's happened here, but yeah, we do kind of recognize homeschooling in Los Angeles County. Yeah. So I had written sort of a supplemental brief in response to part of that, because his brief recounted, well, we just don't really think homeschooling is very good, and there's all kinds of problems, and but it's kind of legal. So in my response brief that I pointed out that, LA Times had done a survey and it said the LA Unified School District is the worst school district in America, and it's it's unsafe, and there's all kinds of bad things. And so he got up at oral argument and said, well, there's been some things said about LA Unified School District that I don't quite agree with, but it's kind of okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and isn't that often the story? I mean, it's not that school districts necessarily embrace homeschooling, but even, the school district that my children would attend, they just sort of are glad if you don't make a stink with them,
Right. So you actually grew up in Riverside County, not too far from Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a different sort of area, but it's probably about 90 miles from Los Angeles.
Is that part of why you chose to look at Los Angeles?
I think it's part of why I knew about Los Angeles, but I had worked there. I had a wonderful experience working at a research library in Pasadena after college, and I learned about the Pasadena school controversy while I was there, and so that had piqued my interest in Los Angeles history too.
Nice. I want to read you a quote. This has been one of the, so just so everyone knows, in reading Dixie's dissertation and some of her other writings, I was astounded to find out that there is an actual researcher who understood the case. And the reason that it's so astounding is because in this book, Homeschooling, The History and Philosophy of a Controversial Practice, by the bête noire of parental rights and homeschooling, Professor James Dwyer from William & Mary University. He wrote about the case. In perhaps the most contorted exercise in statutory interpretation to be found in the history of homeschooling litigation, the judges concluded that statutory authorization for education in a private full-time day school as an alternative to public schooling encompassed homeschools. And that the most contorted exercise in statutory... I was the one who wrote the thing that said, this is how you should interpret the statutes. And they agreed with it. Right. And he calls it contorted exercise. It wasn't contorted. Was it contorted? No.
No, I think it, I don't know Dr. Dwyer. So
I don't
I
either.
can't comment, but I will say that
I'm sure he's a lovely fellow.
it's unusual and interesting what happened in that case, but it doesn't mean that it was incorrect, and the fact is that there were these notes in the law that indicated that the legislature had been functioning on the presumption that this was legal. And so, I just think it's a fascinating case. And I'm glad that the legality of it was really finally settled, because, of course, that's something that has always made homeschoolers nervous in California.
Yeah, that was the thing. So when you were growing up in California, even though you weren't homeschooled yourself, it was because of that Turner case from the 1950s, which had clearly ruled that parents cannot operate little private schools for their own children, which is how parents in California homeschool. There's nothing in the statute that, really says you can't, nothing that really says you can. But, it's broad enough that a lot of people thought, well, it just says I have to teach in English and teach certain subjects and be qualified to teach. And so they just started doing it. And so in the 1950s, the court said that, it's not legal. And that was kind of the presumption for a long time. And then homeschooling grew up kind of organically, and people just sort of ignored that. And then as homeschooling got to be more popular, more and more people started ignoring it. And then LA Unified School District ignored it. And there were only a handful of people over time that didn't ignore it. And they were prominently the Department of Education in California would frequently rattle some chains and say, you guys have to fix this to the legislature and to the school districts. You must, Turner is the law of the land. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say this story of homeschooling in California and really nationally is very much entwined with this feeling that the legality is gray, that you're in a gray area of the law. Not so much anymore, but for many, many decades. And that really affected the behavior of homeschoolers. And you're talking about as it's getting growing and it's getting more popular. Well, this is a really intriguing story, because how do you get support for something that is very, very difficult to do alone when you don't want anyone to notice you're doing it? So in the 1970s and 80s, and of course, we don't have data for how many homeschoolers there were at that time. The best thing we have is when you ask Raymond Moore, how many did you think there were? Or somebody like that, and they throw out a number. But it sort of felt like, I think, to a lot of people that it was on a knife's edge, that it might just fade away. And it really started very small in terms of organizing with people having play groups in the park. And it was very hard to even find out who else was homeschooling. And often I found that people would sort of gather around someone who had a teaching credential, because they could sort of use that person to protect their families, because in California, you could hire a tutor for your children if that person had a teaching credential. So that was another way that it was clear they could homeschool, left over from what people did in the 18th and 19th centuries of having their children tutored. So this whole story is one that involves both determination and fear, and how the fear eventually became smaller and the determination stronger.
And that coincided with a couple of other things as well. And you talk about it in some of your later writings, technology and, as homeschooling became more accessible, more people, the barriers to entry got lower and lower and lower. Before we leave the California homeschool case and get into that part, I just want to point out that we at HSLDA have available a nice collection of essays. These are actually in response to Elizabeth Bartholet, Homeschool Freedom, How It Works and Why We Must Protect It. And the very first article in here, shameless self-promotion time. The very first article in here is called Look Back at the Great California Homeschool Case of 2008 and What It Means for Today, by a little-known author called James R. Mason. It's a wonderful read. I've given you a copy of it. You will laugh, you'll cry, it will move you.
I look forward to it.
That's right.
There's no more important case.
It's a great case. It was great fun for me to work on it. And I was so delighted to read somebody who'd read the case And I mean, most opponents of homeschooling or most skeptics of homeschooling read the case and they have that same kind of reaction that Dr. Dwyer had, that, oh, somebody pulled the wool over. Elizabeth Bartholet actually said that she didn't acknowledge that there was a legal argument at all that won. It was pressure. There was so much of this brutal pressure applied to the three judges that they felt compelled to reverse their opinion.
Hadn't worked for 60 years.
Well, anyway, let's get on
Yes.
to your more recent writing. You write frequently and often about homeschooling. And one of your more recent articles is Reconsidering Homeschooling, Part 1 and Part 2. And so the Part 1 is growth and benefits, and Part 2 is challenges and solutions. So what did you see about the growth and benefits of homeschooling?
Well, we are just in a fascinating period in American education right now, due in large part to the pandemic school lockdowns and policies in so many states, and also lockdowns that affected parents working and working from home. But as a historian, when I saw some of these changes in education happening, I was thinking about it over the long term, because all that happened in the pandemic is in the context of the history that came before it. So there are various different numbers for how many homeschoolers there were right before and then right in the middle of the pandemic. But all the numbers agree that the numbers at least doubled over the course of a single summer, the summer of 2020. Some say more. My number that I think is probably most accurate suggests that it went up to about 11% of students at that time being homeschooled. Up from about 5. Yeah. So, I mean, that's an enormous portion of American children. And that has since gone down, but not back down to 5%. Just maybe 2 or 3 percentage points. And we're still having data coming in about that. And of course, homeschoolers don't really like to be counted. So there's lots of considerations when you're thinking about which data you're going to use. And there are a lot of different numbers out there based on different definitions of homeschooling and collection methods. But anyway, I asked myself the question, why do people who use public or private normative schools, and especially public ones, why were they willing to homeschool, to turn on a dime and homeschool? And, the reasons that were floated around there were, well, people saw what was happening in their schools for the first time, they didn't like it, or parents realized it was horrible for children to be on the computer for 6 hours a day, or they realized they could do it in 2 hours and then be done, or things like that. And I think those were probably all reasons. But if they thought that homeschooling was abusive, did not give a good education, was neglectful, it wouldn't have mattered. They would have found a different solution. So all of these normative families, mainstream families, who were not countercultural, as most homeschoolers have been in one way or another for many years, turned to this thing that, has always been considered a little bit on the edge. And that to me was evidence that in spite of the fact that before the pandemic, these folks were not homeschooling, it meant essentially that they thought it was fine. So then I started to ask myself the question of, okay, can we dig a little deeper into why they did this and what the effects are going to be over time, and how the public and the media have responded to this. It's just been really, really fascinating. We're starting to see data trickle in about it. And so I wanted to connect that to what I had found in the history.
And the data that's trickling in, what's it showing you?
Well, it's really only coming in the last 2 months or 3 months because, originally, basically we're getting newspaper articles where a journalist would interview somebody who had started homeschooling and ask them why, and they'd say, because my kid wasn't learning anything or whatever, but you can't really generalize from that. So, like I said, it's still coming in, and those do seem to be some of the top reasons, but it's not something that's really settled yet. But it does seem that this is a different demographic, homeschooling for different reasons than previous homeschoolers did, but entering into the same practice.
I have a hypothesis, and I'd like to run it by you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when, the public schools were all closed down and everybody got a taste of having their kids at home, and a lot of people were working remotely that maybe hadn't been before, it kind of built in a new permission structure as well. People who may not have considered homeschooling as an option for themselves actually had an experience of being home with their kids in a way that was different, that they might not have ever chosen on their own. And so some of them stuck with it. Some of them may have put their kids back in public school, but today in their own minds, they have a new kind of permission structure because they've tried it and it wasn't so bad, even if they didn't, technically homeschool, but even with Zoom school through the public schools, they were home with their kids, and a lot of people learned that they liked it, and now it's a much more easily available option with a lot fewer barriers. What do you think of that hypothesis?
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I would add that when I'm talking about the doubling of homeschoolers, that actually doesn't include children who are just doing Zoom school, and you probably remember at the very beginning of the school lockdowns in the spring of 2020, a lot of celebrities and things going on social media and saying, shout out to homeschool parents, like this is so hard. And a lot of homeschoolers were saying, well, first of all, yeah, like what did you think we were doing all day? We are trying to educate our children. But also, what you're doing is not exactly what most of us do. Just being the hands of a teacher in a public school who's on a screen and you're just the enforcer. That's not what most homeschooling families do. I mean, homeschooling families have used online curricula and distance learning and things like that. But there's an authority that homeschooling parents have over their children's education that is, I think, the distinguishing factor in defining homeschooling. Because, of course, all homeschooling doesn't even happen at home. But there was this moment where everyone suddenly felt like they suddenly understood that homeschooling was hard. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people said a lot of nice and supportive things. And then a lot of people started homeschooling. And that was, this boom. As is the title of my book manuscript, I'm working on the homeschool boom. There was this boom. But then recently, in the past year or so, and especially in the past 6 months, we've seen journalism and other media change that tack and raising alarm about homeschooling, especially with the idea that homeschooling may be abusive or that homeschooled children may be at a higher risk of abuse. And that's been very interesting to watch because we had an upswell of support and gratitude. But this alarmism is not an upswell. It's something that is happening through articles, documentaries, and things like that. So I'm curious to see where that goes and how that affects public opinion.
Do you have a sense, as a historian who's studied homeschooling since the 50s, of why that backlash has occurred? Because we've all noticed it, of course. And it seems to be a focus on anecdotal sorts of things as opposed to, based on any kind of data. And, but it's a definite shift in tone by some in the media.
Yes. And, we have to be careful because, of course, we don't know people's motivations. So we can't ascribe motivation. But I will say that I've noticed that many of these articles, there have been articles at PBS, there's been articles at in Slate, there was the Amazon documentary about Bill Gothard that mentioned homeschooling a lot. So there have been these things around generally what they do. There's a Washington Post series. Generally what they do is find people who had terrible experiences or did terrible things, and then they generalize from those people. So even with something like the Shiny Happy People Duggar documentary, which, any adult who cares about children will find quite disturbing, you're talking about picking an example of a family that is really a true believer in a particular kind of faith and a particular kind of homeschooling. And one of the things that some of my acquaintances and colleagues have helped me understand about that is that, that's not even really representative of that very small sector of homeschooling. but a lot of that just, it sort of intimates or implies that we need to be afraid about homeschooling. And some of these articles too, when you look at them, they say, I didn't get a proper education. I had to make up my own high school transcript, so I could go to college. And the elephant in the room with this is that all of this is based on a presumption that had these children gone to public school, they would not have been abused by their parents, and they would have gotten a good education. And both of those, as far as I can see, are false. We do not have data about relative risk of abuse between homeschooling or public school or any other type of schooling. I'm aware of 2 studies, both recent, and one found a slightly higher risk for homeschoolers, one found a slightly lower, not particularly significant. But the implication is parents aren't trustworthy. And there is really not, in my opinion, evidence for that. There's certainly evidence for intervening in abusive situations, but not for suggesting that if children are not in school, they're going to get a worse education or be neglected.
Yeah. I've written this before, and I'm interested to see what you think. If you compare the homeschooling system, as opposed to looking at anecdotal, this family or that family, but the homeschooling system, and compare it to the public school system, as opposed to looking at, bad examples of public schools or things that happen in public schools, how do you think the homeschooling system stacks up against the public school system, both educationally and socially, and and a host of other?
Yeah, it's hard to say because, again, homeschoolers are what sociologists call a hidden population. They would rather not be studied, and that's because for so long it was unclear whether or not they were their practices were legal. But so the studies we have tend to be sort of limited to certain groups or things, but we do have some evidence that they perform slightly better on average scholastically, that they are at the same level or better socially. There are some studies of like social engagement. Are they engaged civically when they become adults and things like that? So again, there's some indication that they're doing at least as well as public school students. And certainly there's a wide range. I teach college students. We have at the college where I teach a variety of students who come from different schooling backgrounds. And really you'll get good students and bad students from all of them. So my feeling is that it's not accurate to presume that schools do a better job. And in fact, if you're paying attention as a homeschooler, you will likely get a better academic result than a school.
In your part 2, Reconsidering Homeschooling Challenges and Solutions, you start out by saying, the task of educating children at home may not be as tall as you think. Mm-hmm. What's that about?
Most of us went to school. We're starting to see now parents who were homeschooled and are beginning to homeschool their children. But that's just about the first time this has happened. Most of us went to school. And so, especially if we're not people who have a habit of thinking about education, we think education and we think school. So I think there can be a lot of internal pressure that parents put on themselves to recreate school at home. But as a teacher myself and as someone who's very interested in education, has been her whole life. And as a homeschooling mother, I can tell you that that's really not how it works, that you can't apply classroom management techniques or even curricula and assignments that you would give to a classroom of 30 students to your class of 4 grades in 4 different ages who are also your children. It's a totally different dynamic, and it also gives you the flexibility to actually respond to your particular children and their academic and emotional and character needs in ways that good teachers try very hard to do in classrooms, but have to do on a larger level. So I think a lot of people, I just got an email actually from a young mom the other day who had read an essay I'd written on teaching history to elementary school children. And that essay suggests that imagination is more important than memorization in the early grades for history. And she said, oh, I just started homeschooling and I'm so overwhelmed. And thank you for telling me I can use stories. What does it come to that we don't think we can use stories in teaching very young children? And, I said to her, it's like having children. When you have your first child, you think you could never manage 3, but you grow with the children. So when you start kindergarten, you're not starting with a 7th grader. You're starting with a little bit of phonics, a little bit of arithmetic, a lot of painting, a lot of nature walks, a lot of singing, taking the child to interesting places and having conversations with the child. And we know from research into child development and pedagogy that, for example, language acquisition comes mostly from conversation. And even something like what we would call delayed reading, a child who's 7 years old and is just starting to learn to read will have no ill effects from that later on. However, if they don't develop the large motor skills that they need to develop at that age, they will have trouble writing because they will not have the core strength to hold themselves so that they can write with their hands. So in some ways, I want to say to parents who are starting out in homeschooling, just start and you'll learn along the way. Don't try to be perfect. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
A couple of things you said are really intriguing to me. The idea of classroom management when you have 25 or 30 students is largely eliminated with homeschoolers, but you have sibling management. And the delayed reading, when one of my kids was a delayed reader, and it really worried me. I mean, it bothered me a lot because I went to school my whole life, and state school from K through bachelor's degree, and I could read before I went to school, and I just thought my kids would probably be able to read really soon. And one of my boys, my wife was very diligent in teaching them, and he just wasn't interested or something. He just wasn't picking it up, and it was bothering me a lot. And my wife was like, it's okay, and he's doing fine. And she did all those nature walks, and she was just, she was a really great homeschool mom. This was, many years ago. And suddenly, when he was 8 years old, he could read. Mm-hmm. And when he was 9 years old, he could read, like a high school student. I mean, it just went from 0 to 60 overnight almost. And we never acted as if there was a problem. I mean, I felt like there was a problem, but we never actually acted like there was a problem. And it was just a couple of years ago that we were telling this story in front of my now adult child who's got kids of his own. And he was like, wait, what? I couldn't read till I was 8?
Right.
That's crazy.
Well, we're so interiorly imbued with a conception of education that's really the conception held by public school administrators. It's not even necessarily public school teachers, but it's sort of an administrative view of education that sometimes, sadly, really sets aside things like child development. This isn't to say that parents shouldn't be diligent. If you have a child who's 10 years old and is not getting it, or even a little bit younger and is not getting it, you need to attend to that. Your child may have a different way of learning, or may have an eye problem that's not showing up on the exams, or things like that. So my saying the task isn't as tall as you think isn't saying don't bother. It isn't saying, don't push yourself to do it every day. It's just saying calm down. You can do this. And in terms of the reading, one of the main reasons that we began homeschooling was that my eldest child, who is absolutely brilliant, just so smart and articulate, was having trouble learning to read in kindergarten at home with me. And I was surprised by that because I knew how smart she was. She was also very resistant to studying. And I had read the studies about Finland, right? I had read the more, so I knew this. I know that as long as you're reading by 9, it's going to be okay. That didn't change my maternal feeling that, oh no, what's happening? Something would be wrong. Well, eventually we discovered that she had a visual problem and she needed vision therapy. And once we started the vision therapy, she learned to read within 3 weeks, right? Her eyes weren't working together properly. But we kept her at home. So she learned to read when she was 7. We kept her at home because we knew that if she went to school, nobody there would understand that. No one there would understand that it was okay that this 5-year-old couldn't read. And she, being so smart, would realize that people thought she was dumb. And I didn't want her to think that because, first of all, it wasn't true. And secondly, it's, intelligence isn't the most important thing either. But because of that, we were able to continue to feed her other interests and continue to help her grow. And, she reads, I don't even know what level she reads. She's incredible. She's an incredible reader and writer. So again, that sort of allows you to keep your child who's a little bit different in a place where they can get the support they need without getting the harm or the bullying that they might experience.
There's also the fallacy that, just because you were born within so many months of your peer and you get put into a classroom with 25 or 30 others who were born in that same age range, that you should all progress at the same pace in the same way at the same time. Right. That's really just kind of a horrible approach to childhood and learning and recognizing that we're all unique and we have different skills and talents and different pace in our own development. One of the early lessons that I learned here as a lawyer involved a case I was in, and a school psychology professor I'd become acquainted with helped me as an expert witness. And what he taught me was, look, it isn't really useful to compare this kid with his age cohort because every kid is different. What you have to do is figure out how this kid compares to what his innate ability is. Mm-hmm. So not everybody has the same abilities. The bell curve is one of those, intractable things that if you take 100 kids, 15 of them are going to be on the top and 15 of them are going to be on the bottom. And there's no way around that. And the question is, somebody like me when I was growing up, I could read before I went to school and I was pretty smart and I could get along really well in school without actually having to do work. And so if you compared me to my peers, I was pretty high. If you compared me to my ability, I was pretty low. And in this case, this child had a very low IQ, but his mom was a really good homeschool mom, very diligent and attended to his needs such that he was actually performing higher than you would expect for someone with his, special needs. And so that's sort of forgotten when you're trying to march 25 kids, through life from the age of 5 to the age of 18, all in lockstep.
And I don't think the good teachers want to do that, but over time they themselves have become much more limited in how they can even make choices about their own classroom and the way that they can interact with individual students and all of that. So there are certainly good public schools out there and private ones too, but they're not accessible to everyone. There are challenges, like you said, like that sibling management. Your kids don't get a break from each other. They don't have as many things of their own. And if you are the primary homeschooling parent, you also don't have that time when they're in school to attend to the many, many other things that are part of being a homemaker, or if you're doing other work or whatever it is. So there are challenges, but I'll tell you, last year, I read aloud Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade to my 8-year-old son.
Once more into the breach.
And at the end of it, I watched him shiver.
Oh, yeah. It's a pretty good poem.
And I just thought to myself, I get to be a part of that. So it really is a joy and a privilege. Yeah. It really is.
As a parent, to be there at that eureka moment for your child, it's kind of, you can't really replace that.
And also it gives you information. Yeah. So how would I have known that my son, who really is rather quiet, he's in between two loud children, so he's really rather quiet. How would I have known he would thrill to such a thing? And then I can direct him. We read The Lady of Shalott, another Tennyson poem, because of that. So I can direct him and pull things out of him that I might really just not notice. otherwise. So it is a way that allows you to learn things about your children that can help you parent them well.
Yeah. Well, I would like to know more about, as a historian who started studying homeschooling even before you got married and had kids, what was your decision-making like when you decided to homeschool? I mean, told us a little bit about your daughter. Was that the instrumental thing, or had you already decided?
Well, that was it for those early years. But, really, and I did in my dissertation work and for my book, a lot of oral history interviews, which are basically a historian interviews a source. So I interviewed a lot of homeschoolers, especially people who had been active in the 80s and 90s. And many of them had quite a number of reasons for homeschooling. And some of them were ideological ones like religion, or religiously related reasons. But many of them also had circumstantial reasons. And for me, it was a combination of the two. So I'm sorry to say that the public schools in the county that I live in have very poor results, low graduation rate, and we have some other social problems in town. And so I had even consulted my pediatrician. He said, no, don't send her there if you can avoid it, which is not to knock the schools. I know there are a lot of good teachers doing their best and a lot of families who really rely on them. But so we had decided that we would try not to use the public schools. Now, the town I come from is unusual in that it's relatively small, but we have a lot of small private schools. Well, I'm here to tell you that like so many Americans, we can't afford to send our children to those. So even ones that are wonderful, and even with financial aid, middle class family really can't access those schools. So for us, it was a combination of, one type of schooling basically being off the table, the private school is being inaccessible. And on top of that, my conviction that my interest in education and my conviction that I could help my children thrive, that made that happen. So we sort of fell into it. We didn't go into it because we're against schools or we think it's the only way to educate. But we found, like so many families, that it's a very good way to educate, and it was a way that helped us help our children grow.
So how long have you been actually homeschooling?
7 years.
7 years. How much longer are you going to be homeschooling?
Well, as most homeschooling parents will tell you, we make a decision every year, but I'm starting to anticipate that it will be all the way through for those circumstantial reasons in part, but also because we do have ways to be creative about getting support with the more advanced subjects in high school that we may need support with. We don't have a chemistry lab at home. We do have a community college. We also have a local Catholic college that we could send our high school juniors and seniors to for intro to biology and things like that. So that's our intention right now. And I'll say that we have hard days and we have good days, but when I write up our proof of progress at the end of every year, I'm usually very happy.
Yeah, you're not unusual in homeschool families. I know, my wife was much more committed to the idea of homeschooling before our kids got to be school age, and I started out with, I don't know. I mean, we can give it a go. We'll try it out. And it was a few years before it kind of just became our way of life, and you couldn't imagine doing it any other way, but it didn't start out that way.
Yeah, you start to realize some of the benefits, and that was what I found in the interviews I did, that people became more committed over time because they learned things about it. But also, as I mentioned, I wasn't married when I began graduate school, but while I was conducting some of my interviews, I was expecting my first child. And that was when I learned how homeschooling for many families is really not a compartment of their life, but runs like a thread throughout their entire lifestyle. Because people were asking me, are you going to homeschool this child? And I said, this child is not born yet. I have no idea. But a lot of families, even if they're not doing active school with their children who are before school age, still sort of involve them in, as Charlotte Mason would say, education as atmosphere. And for me, that's something that families do. That is family life, is the togetherness and the rearing of children together. as a family. And that is really an educational pursuit. And every parent is, in fact, an educator.
And that's so important to remember that in my family, this was really important, and I gather in yours too. It isn't an isolated family thing. It's a way of life that you do in community with a lot of other people who share many of the same values. We wouldn't have been able to thrive. I mean, my kids, I'm sure, wouldn't have been able to thrive as much if it weren't for that. And so we were involved in a couple of really good co-ops, and some of my kids were really more academically inclined, and those co-ops, we got really good teachers to teach them good stuff, 1 day a week, and they did really well. And through church as well, the community of the homeschooling is a thread through the life of that community is really important. I just want to ask you, so a lot of people listening, I'm sure a lot of the moms out there listening, don't have PhDs from Notre Dame.
Yes.
So should they just hang it up and give up this whole idea of homeschooling?
First of all, let me just say there's a saying among professors or in the academy that in the academy, PhDs are like noses. Everybody has one. So even though it's a very specialized degree, it doesn't really set you apart, particularly if you're hanging out with a bunch of professors. But, in an earlier draft of that article you've been referencing, which of course was thousands of words longer, and the dear editor helped me cut it down, I mentioned that before I was even born, my family hosted the homeschooling public leader, John Holt, overnight in our home. And he scolded my father for giving my brother uninvited teaching. And I put this anecdote in the essay because I said, my father has a PhD. I have a PhD. It's not easy for us. It's not an easy thing to do. And it doesn't matter that you've devoted 10 years of your life, like I have, to researching homeschooling, because really every parent is an educator. We are given that gift. We are put in that role. We are the ones who clap when our children first walk, and we are the ones who teach our children what a loving face looks like. So we are their primary teachers. But also, the hardest things about homeschooling are not learning the material so you can teach your children. It's not finding someone to teach chemistry because you don't know what you're doing. It's not tracking down a veterinarian to dissect a cow heart with you. It's not choosing curricula, which can be very overwhelming. It's relating emotionally with your children in the context of homeschooling. And that is what mothers are about, is emotionally relating with their children so that they grow into healthy adults. And so, I firmly believe that if you are diligent and you are attentive, you can homeschool your children. And there's no guarantee that someone who's a trained teacher will do better. They'll certainly have some wonderful resources and experience that might make it a little bit easier for them. But there's not a bar that's set for qualifications for teaching your children. You already are your child's teacher.
Yeah, and there's, those of us who homeschool, at least in part for religious reasons, believe that, the Lord has placed this love for our children in our hearts that is irreplaceable. And, drawing on that, some of the best homeschool moms I've ever known had a high school diploma and no more education than that.
Well, my father, who is a professor emeritus now of educational psychology, he always told me education is an orientation towards our young. It's how adults orient themselves towards their youth, and the education is in the relationship. And, I would hope that most adults have that orientation of care towards children. And of course, it's strongest toward your own. But you can pull in other people to help you. And it's just the natural way of things that we desire to teach our young and that we love them. And those are the things you need. Those are the things you need to motivate you to do the work that you'll have to do.
And that's such a freeing message. When we first started homeschooling, we probably kind of started out more of that little schoolroom in the home. But then as we grew, especially as my wife Debbie grew in the role, and we came to conclude that relationship is a lot more important than regulation, it just was a freeing experience because, kids are kind of learning machines to begin with, and having that relationship with them, in their formative years and then on into adulthood is irreplaceable.
And if you can, as a homeschooling parent, express joy and enthusiasm, it will go fabulously. I mean, we all have our days when we can't do that, but your children, your young children at least, want to love what you love. And if you love what is beautiful and true, they will be attracted to it as well. So especially in the younger ages, when you're really not focusing as much on amassing knowledge as you are developing habits of study and increasing curiosity and feeding interests, taking your interests and working with those can carry those children into a deep love of literature or history or math, and the beauty of them that really motivates them when it comes time to study.
Well, this has been a really, really fun conversation, Dixie. I really appreciate that you would come into my office. Just for the sake of everybody out there, we tried to do this podcast a couple of weeks ago from my secret studio hidden deep in the bowels of HSLDA and an undisclosed location where Dixie was
my bunker,
the bunker in the mountains of Western Virginia. And the internets just weren't happening that day. And so Dixie graciously agreed to come into the office where we could look face to face. And I will say this too, while I have come to appreciate the fact that we can do things through the Zoom window, being able to sit here and talk to you face to face is just so much more rewarding. And it's something that I think, it's not just a homeschooling thing, but, when churches started opening again and we could get back together again, it's just so much more fulfilling to have face-to-face interaction rather than through that Zoom window.
Absolutely. Talking to other people in person is what our country needs now.
And that's so much of what our kids need too, is to see, you talked about this, when our kids see in our faces a reflection of the joy we have in them. It's irreplaceable. You can't do anything better than that.
Yeah, and realistically, you're probably still going to lose your temper occasionally over a math problem. But you know what? Then you apologize and your children learn and you learn together. And that bonds you together, but it also, it models a healthy family life.
Well, I'm going to give you the last word before we close.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here.
Well, you don't, and no words of, wisdom or correction, Jim, you idiot. What did you say that for? Nothing like that?
I think that what I would like to say perhaps is that, as a historian, I try to start with questions, not answers. So in my historical work, I withhold judgment, and I'm seeking questions to answers to questions about history and homeschooling. I'm not seeking to defend homeschooling in my history work. But I will say that the experience of teaching my own children has helped me to understand homeschooling better. And I just want to encourage young mothers and fathers who think they want to try this, that if they believe that it's good for their family, they really can do it. And they will figure out the way to do it for their own family. And they don't have to do it like the Joneses, but they love their children. And I just encourage you to try.
Well, those are very encouraging words, and I appreciate them, and I second them. So once again, my guest today has been Professor Dixie Dillion Lane. She has a PhD from Notre Dame and has written widely about homeschooling. She's also a college professor. So thanks again to you for joining us today. Her most important role, I think maybe she'll agree with me, is homeschooling her own children, as we all homeschool parents think. So today, if you're not a member of HSLDA, we'd love for you to join us. Please go to, it says please go to our homeschooling talks, homeschooltalks.com/join. or if you're interested in supporting homeschool families through our various activities of making homeschooling possible, consider donating to our Compassion or Freedom funds at homeschooltalks.com/donate. Thanks for listening, everyone. Once again, I'm Jim Mason, President of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this has been another episode in Homeschool Talks.
Today's program is made possible by HSLDA's team of educational consultants. Are you feeling overwhelmed by the number of curriculum options to choose from? Or maybe you're frustrated because your child is struggling and you're not sure what to do next. Our educational consultants can help. As an HSLDA member, you have access to customized, practical guidance on everything from lesson planning and record keeping to helping a child with learning difficulties. If you want to experience less frustration and more progress in your homeschool, get support from our educational consultants by becoming a member of HSLDA. Learn more at hslda.org/join. That's hslda.org/join. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.